This is a video response to my students' questions from parts 1 and 2 of Fahrenheit 451. So I've selected the best 9 questions, or the most intriguing 9 questions, and I'm going to respond to them. Here we go. So, how does Montag forget when and where he met Mildred? So, every time that I have a question up here, what I'll do is I'll put in a link for you to follow so that you can do further reading. These are articles that I found very interesting. But my direct response to how does Montag forget is the question should not be how, the question should be why. How implies that it seems only unrealistic that he would forget his where he met his wife and when. But that's not the point. The point is that this is symbolic, right? Why does he forget when and where he met Mildred? He forgets because it's not an actual thing, it's about a symbolism. A symbolism is supposed to represent that they are so bombarded with the distractions of the modern world, the technology around them, the seashells, the TV walls, that they have no real connection anymore. And I think that's the point too of the novel. This is a novel about forgetting. Everyone here is forgetting things all the time. They forget how things used to be, and they make up stories like that firefighters always, rather firemen always burned books. They never put out fires. They made fires. This entire novel is about forgetting, forgetting what life is really like because we're too distracted with everything else. Um, and I think something that we're not considering is that at the end of the novel, he does remember when and where he met Mildred. But it'll be too late. I won't say why, but when you get to the end of the novel, this question will become even more meaningful because he does remember when and where he met Mildred. All right. These are 2 questions, very similar, from Kim and Nick, that I think are very good questions. Essentially, what they're asking is why is it that it's only firefighters who are burning books? Right? Well, how come it's not police officers or other parts of law enforcement, let's say? Why is it that firefighters are the ones that are chosen for the job of book burning? Well, primarily it's a functionality, meaning it's easier to go from firefighter to firemen. So that is an easy transition. It's much harder to go from, I don't know, paramedic to a book burner. So it's a functionality of the novel. But I think it works in many levels. Montag, for instance, is a firefighter, or fireman, I should say, who is disillusioned with his job and with what he does. And I think that's part of a trope within this kind of dystopian writing. Like in 1984, you have a character who works for the system and realizes he doesn't like the system and he wants to get out of the system. So this is a trope of the writing. So Montag is a firefighter who is disillusioned, and therefore he wants to stop what he's doing. Right. That's the point. Is that this is a narrative about people who are living in a world that is dystopian, and somehow humanity has gone wrong, and they want to leave that world, out of that world. So it's better to make the firefighter do that. Also, this is a kind of throwback to Greek mythology. You have to think about why even firefighters altogether, or firemen in this book, what they're doing with fire, right? The gift that was given to men, fire, in order to create, they turn for destruction. So it's interesting because what is given to men, the implication of giving them fire is that the gods gave them knowledge. And what we've done with that knowledge is that we destroy knowledge, we destroy information, we destroy ideas. So there's a fire and book burning is very important, and that's why the job primarily is given to firefighters. Again, these are links that you can follow on the PowerPoint on the drive. Okay, they have great articles that I think you should read. All right, the next one is: are there people in the story that do not rely on technology? Yes, yes, there are people in the story that do not rely on technology. Well, Clarisse and Clarisse's family is the first example. And this one is an interesting point because Clarisse's family is a family of outcasts. I mean, there's this moment that is very ironic at the beginning where they sit around the table talking, and we're supposed to be aghast. Or at least Montag is like, what are they doing? Sitting around talking. That's crazy. But the point of that, right, is that they are emblems of a dying old world. This doesn't exist anymore. People don't just sit around talking anymore. They're distracted with their headphones and their TVs, every other technological advancement, right? But if you want to see something interesting here, is that the uncle that Clarisse says gets in trouble for walking around. That's actually another short story that Bradbury writes called The Pedestrian, that is published before this book. And in The Pedestrian, there's a guy who's walking around the city, and he's looking at as he's walking, he's looking at there's nobody in the streets, and he's looking at people just watching TV in their homes. And the idea is that he is one of the last people who goes off for a walk and enjoys nature and is connected to the world in some way while everybody else is zoned out in front of a TV. Then at the end of the story, he gets arrested by a mechanical car, or at least that's the whole point. The cop is stopping him, and then by the time he comes around to the cop car, he realizes there's nobody there. It's just a mechanical car, right? Technology has overrun the world, and that story that's the connection that Bradbury was making to his own short story. That's the uncle, Clarisse's uncle. So, why would someone as smart as Captain Beatty support a society that chooses to burn books? This question, I think it's very complex because there are many possible answers. I'm going to give you the two that I like the most. Beatty is an educated man, but I think the clearest answer here is that this is an issue of power and of controlling ideas. He who is in power, because he's the one in charge of the firemen and all that, he represents people in power who know the truth, right? But still spew lies to the world in order to control them. So I think that's the clearest answer. He knows the truth. He represents people in power who know really what's going on, but they still want to remain in power, so then they control information. The answer I prefer is that he is an intellectual who is a cynic. He is the people in the world who know there's a problem with the world, but you know what? They don't care enough to fix it. I think that's the answer I prefer because I think it reiterates themes within the book that are very prevalent. There's a kind of general apathy, as in we live in this world and that's just the way it is. And I think that answer is resonates with me more because it's about knowing that there's a problem and yet doing nothing about it. All right. Now, why does the author decide to kill off Clarisse so early in the story? That's true. Is there a kind of symbolism, or is it mostly plot device? Well, I mean, if it's plot device, then we would have to call Clarisse a catalyst. She dies, and because she dies, then Montag is set on a mission. But what about the woman who burns in the story? Isn't she a catalyst too? Are there more than one catalyst? So what exactly is Clarisse's point? If we just reduce her to a plot device, which, I mean, functionally speaking, her death does spur something in him. So yeah, functionally speaking, she's a plot device. But I think she's more than that. I think Clarisse is meant to be a contrast to Mildred. Clarisse, clear, bright, she's in love with nature, she's all that is good, and yet she dies, right? The point is that we killed good in this world. And that unlike Mildred, who lives at the beginning of the story, meaning she is saved by technology, right? Clarisse is killed by technology. And there's a kind of like the life that wanted to live is ended, and yet the life that wanted to end, Clarisse, Mildred, who attempted suicide, is spared. So there's that paradox there, that contrast. So I think the two, Clarisse and Mildred, are meant to juxtapose each other. So I think it's very important that we look at Clarisse in that light as a contrast, because these are the women in Montag's world. Montag is the main character, and it's very normal for women in stories of this period to be in the peripheral. Women were always sort of like around, and they were meant to represent things, but they weren't, most of the time, primary characters. So I think they're supposed to be contrasts, right? Like two different worlds pulling Montag from one way to the other. Okay. Is there a reason why the author keeps on mentioning the war in the background? Yes, that's very important. And if you read part 3, you'll see why. But I won't say why, but I will say this. I think the best way to think about it is another connection to 1984 and Breakfast at Tiffany's. In 1984, there's always a war going on in the back. And in Breakfast at Tiffany's, while it is about a girl who, a society girl who's going around town, having varied relationships with men and having a kind of superficial life, and there's a war happening in the back. But like, in these two examples that I've just mentioned, and in this one, this is a common trope in literature where the subplot replaces or interferes within the main plot. So whatever's in the background that you're it's just there and you think, oh, that doesn't matter. At some point near the end of the story, it becomes apparent that, oh my God, it did matter. We just never saw it, right? So I think that's what's happening with the war in the background for sure. The war in the background is supposed to represent this dualism as well, meaning a war outside, a war inside, right? Actual struggle out there with bombing and all that stuff, and then internal struggle with Montag. It's also the society that is so lost. I mean, their concerns are so petty. They're about like driving fast and watching TV and listening to stuff, and yet there's craziness happening around them. And I think it's supposed to represent how out of it they are, how bubbled they are, how they don't realize what the things that really matter in the world. I mean, the ladies are crying because they read a poem, right? But there's death all around. Even in that conversation, there's death because there's a comment about people who have died in the war and abortions, and yet they cry over a poem that is about the beauty of nature. What? So there's a dualism happening here, where there are trivial concerns on the forefront, and then there are real concerns in the background. Kind of like when Mildred is looking at the TVs, in the back, right in the back, there is a play. So there's that aspect to the entire story that is very performative. Like nothing really matters, but there are things happening that are important. All right. Now that I mentioned the poem, is there a connection? Is there a way that the poem Dover Beach could be applied to the people of today in the same way that Mildred and her friends when Montag reads it? That's a very good question. I think so. I think the point of the poem is that poetry moves, and poetry is supposed to trigger emotional responses, and that's what happens with him. I mean, these are people. They're all alive and dead. If you think about it, Mildred is dead at the beginning and then brought back. She's a kind of alive and dead. The dog is mechanical, but it's not really living, right? So there's a kind of like alive and dead. The women, right around before they read the poem, are talking about abortions, another alive and dead. The old woman is more alive when she's dying because she's dying for a cause. I mean, there's this constant idea of alive and dead that it's happening in the story, and I think the poem is triggering that duality in the characters, right? The poem is reminding us that we may be physically alive, but we are emotionally dead, intellectually starved. And I think that's the point, which is why they cry. They cry because it's almost like they were brought into the world, birthed again by a poem. I mean, it's very, it's very, it's very loving of literature, very idealistic of literature, the power of literature. But I think it's true. I mean, there's that idea that somehow reading and feeling brings us alive, and they can't handle it, right? They want to go back to their cocoons of apathy. So, and the poem is also kind of calling us back from technology, right? Because it's all about nature, and as nature is calling, and we should answer the call. That's the point. And they don't want to. They want to stay wrapped in their four walls, wrapped in their comfort. So, why does Montag's wife attempt to commit suicide? Does she somehow know this is wrong? Yes, yes, and yes. She is supposed to represent society. And I think the point is that deep down inside, we, society, know that something's not right. And the fact that she attempts suicide in the intro scene of the book has a really, really startling, startling, I guess, impact on the reader. I mean, think about it. You're reading it, and it's a pleasure to burn. Then he goes, takes a shower. Then he goes home, and when he gets home, oh, my wife committed suicide, and the whole thing is so satiric if you really think about it. Like there's some guys hanging around with cigarettes, pumping her stomach. She'll be fine, whatever. We do this like, 3 times a night, 7 times a night. There's so much hyperbole, right? And the entire experience is understated, like, it's just another attempt at suicide. So it's so satiric that it's meant to shock us. Like, what? Suicide is not an easy thing. It's not a trivial thing. It's a real thing. I mean, it's literally life and death. So having this at the beginning tells us that human life has little value in to this society anyway. And Mildred, who's that society, is unhappy. And she's unhappy. Remember, sleeping pills is what she takes because she's dull. She is only mechanically alive. She's not fully alive. And I think that's the point. The point is that she recognizes, like society does, that something is not right with our existence. That we are simply kept alive by technology. We are not alive. And what are the main features, this is the last question, of this society that should frighten the reader of the story? Wow. It's a huge question. It was a great question, so I put it at the end. It's a very big question. It's very complex. But I'll give you, I guess, my top 5 responses. Number 1, illiteracy. And I don't mean illiteracy in the sense of not being able to read. I mean illiteracy as in not wanting to read, right? Apathetic illiteracy. We can and we don't and we won't, and that's the problem, right? Also, an entertainment-based or obsessed society where we do things or we watch things simply for the lascivious aspect of entertainment. We want to be excited. We want to see things that shock us, right? This is a problem. An entertainment-based and obsessed society. A shallow society that is apathetic. A society that is so superficial that there is no depth to their conversations. There is no higher meaning to anything they do. Another big deal, I think, is fake news. This story is a lot about fake news, like 1984, though 1984 is more about fake news than this one. But there's a constant sort of like reshifting of the facts, alternative facts happening in the story when the news are told. All information is repurposed and told in a different way. And that, I think, it's a very big problem, because the problem with fake news is not that we're being lied to. The problem with fake news is that we don't know what to believe, right? Because we are given truth and mistruth and almost truth and half truth all together. So we don't know what to believe, and when we don't know what to believe, most people just, they throw their hands and surrender. They say, I guess there is no truth in the world. That's the problem. And the last one that I think is a big problem as well, and that is a feature of the story that frightens the modern world, is sensitivity, hypersensitivity. Everyone in the story, at least the people that represent, society as it is, are super sensitive about things, very easily affected by things like think about it. They burn books. They burn books because they were offended. Think about it. They did away with everything that offends them, and I think that's the problem: the hypersensitivity of the world, where we are not willing to deal with controversy, deal with issues, right? That take emotional toll, that take commitment, right? Commitment of thought and of emotion. We're not willing to do that because it offends us, right? So what we are doing is that we're putting away everything that offends us. I think that's a big problem. We are censoring everything and everyone out of the fear of being offensive. And I think that's the problem. I am certain I have offended you, and that's okay. Now, the follow-up assignment for my students, there's part 1 and part 2. I won't cover it here, but it's already on the drive, the PowerPoint. I'll see you on Discord. All right, we're done.